Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Village Park Online. We're so glad that you're with us today. Hope you got your family gathered together. Grab your Bible, grab some coffee, make yourself comfortable. We're going to talk discipleship again this morning. So we want to ask you to just take a moment to like the video, share it, let somebody know that you're on this morning, and we're just going to have a conversation like we've been having the last few weeks about discipleship. So today we want to get started by I want you to think about your profession for a minute. So what you do for a living. And I want you to think about how you got where you are today. Think about, maybe even past professions that you've had, but what kind of brought you to be able to perform the job that you do today so well? So what are some things that you needed along the way that kind of helped you move along or be as good at your job as you are right now? So we want you to just take a minute to comment on that. Just let us know about some things that don't be smirking about what's coming.
Do you want me to share?
No, in a minute.
Okay.
But what are some of the, what are some things that people need in their profession to become really good at their work? So some things that come to your mind, we want you to share it. We'll kind of bounce those ideas around for a little bit. But one of the things that, when I think about mine, some people, they need education, right? Some people go to college. Some, may go to a trade school. Some are self-taught. They learn from books or something like that. Mentoring is another big one. Usually in a lot of ways, like when I was in the fire department, your captain would really train you on the job. And so there was some mentoring that would go on in there as well. And then, of course, you get some hands-on experience. Yeah. One thing to tell people how to do it, but another thing to kind of lead them to that. What about you? So from your extensive training you've received?
Yeah, so definitely the experience. Just kind of getting it as a go. Having a structure would be nice. Some leadership structure that helps. I know the plan already in place, right? The mission statement and all that already laid out. Training to go with that.
Yeah, and like when you're in a job, you receive these things, the education, the training, on the job experience, whatever. And then eventually they kind of send you out to actually do the job, right? And I was talking about it recently that a couple years ago we had this huge moment in our family when I was able to teach Luke how to mow the grass. I mean, it was like the moment as a dad you look forward to, that somebody's going to help you with it. But there's a process, right? You have to show them how to put gas in the gas tank, how to prime it, how to crank it, how to do the self-propelled tires, and then there's also showing them, how the blade cuts and keeping the lines in the wheels. And so there's a process with all of that, and you teach them, you kind of show them how to cut the grass, you show them, okay, this is how you empty the bag, this is the whole process. And so you teach them, and then there's modeling it too, right? You show them how to do those things. You have to show them how to get frustrated when the lawnmower won't crank, right? I mean, you got to show them how to respond to that and lose your testimony maybe a little bit when you hit the lawnmower or kick it. But then there was this, I showed him and then supervised him, and now we're at the point where I can say, hey, it's time to mow the grass. I'll do the weed eating, you mow the grass, and he knows how to do it all. And really, in many ways, the way that we're prepared for our profession, we're prepared for mowing the grass or whatever, really is the essence, I believe, of discipleship and what we've been talking about. So in our first lesson, when we talk about discipleship, we define the when, and that is to follow the Great Commission to go and make disciples. And we said that Village Park, we would measure our success by are we leading people to find and follow Jesus, because that's our mission statement. We exist to lead people to find and follow Jesus. So when we make disciples, that's when we're successful. And then last week we talked about the call, and I actually want us to start there today. So if you have your Bible, we want to encourage you to turn to Matthew chapter 4, and that's where Jesus calls his disciples. And we made a point, and I want it to be kind of the springboard of what we're going to talk about today. But in Matthew chapter 4, calling his disciples, he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." So we said last week that the call is really to follow Jesus, to be transformed by Jesus, and then to be on mission with Jesus. But in that call that Jesus made, I want you to look at it again in verse 19. You're going to see something that's implied, and I think this really, these are kind of the keys to how we make disciples, which is really what we want to talk about today. Jesus said, first, follow me, and he implied that he would intentionally lead them. You follow me, and in that he's saying, follow me because I'm going to lead you. So there's an intentionality to the leadership. And then he says, I will make you. And you see there's a relationship there, me and you. So discipleship is really done within the context of a sound and good relational environment. And then he says, I will make you fishers of men. And so there's a process that he would be making them. He would be transforming them and changing them. And of course, we know the story that what Jesus was really doing is he was making disciples who would eventually, after his death and resurrection and ascension, would then go out and change the world by doing exactly what he did, to make disciples as well. He would make fishers of men, but those fishers of men would go out and do the job. And so it was never to give them the information. He didn't say, I want you to teach the disciples everything I've commanded. He said in Matthew 28:20, I want you to teach them to observe it. Yeah. And so to actually do what he said. So 2 questions that we want you to think about as we kind of jump into this morning is, number 1, are you a disciple? Would you consider yourself a follower of Jesus? Now, I can tell you that I want to say yes to that. I want to say, yes, I'm following Jesus. I'm observing the commandments of Jesus. I'm trying to live my life as a husband, as a friend, as a pastor, as a neighbor, according to what Jesus said. But then I get to the second question, and that is, who are you intentionally discipling right now? And so, yes, there's an element of discipleship where we follow Jesus, but the end of that is to then be able to make disciples. And I think that if I want to truly call myself a follower of Jesus, but I'm not actively being discipled or pouring into someone, that's where I feel like maybe I fall a little bit short.
Yeah, and those are 2 great questions, and they're questions that even we had to ask ourselves and have asked ourselves and continue to ask ourselves. And like you talked about, the definition of what a disciple is, right? Follow me, I will make you fishers of men. None of those are exclusive. It's all together, and that's how you are a disciple. You can't be a disciple without one or the other, right? And so we asked those questions, but we asked ourselves these questions and started talking about how we wanted to lead the church through the discipleship. In that process of searching, as we had kind of started, talking back and forth, we feel like God led us to a particular conference on discipleship, and that was where we met a gentleman named Brandon Gendon. He's a pastor at a church out in Tomball, Real Life Ministries of Texas, and he shared with us this story of Real Life Ministries, and he shared with us the Real Life Discipleship Workbook that we kind of took, and I went through some coaching. We went through some years. I mean, this has been a couple of years in the making. We spent time in these resources given to us, and have taken that, and that's mostly what we're presenting here, and we're adapting that and expanding on it. But yeah, so in the life and ministry of Jesus, and really that's what it's about, is looking at the intentionality of Jesus and seeing what he displayed as a disciple maker, and then applying that to our lives, right? And in the life and ministry of Jesus and the early church, with the disciples with the apostles who led the church, we kind of see 3 keys to making disciples really lived out in their lives. The first is an intentional leader. Second is a relational environment, and the third is a reproducible process. And so we're gonna go through those, each of those today. And so first off is an intentional leader. So we want to ask this question: how would you define the word intentional? What are some words that come to mind when you think of the word intentional?
Yeah, so maybe comment. We'll kind of go back and forth here, but when we talk about one of the keys to making disciples is intentionality. I look in my own life when I think back when I was thinking earlier, who are the people, or how was I discipled? And honestly, I had some people that definitely discipled me. My dad was one. Pastor Hudson at Berean was another. John Gross, who's my mentor now, is definitely actively discipling me. But there were seasons in my life where I was almost accidentally, I was almost like discipled by osmosis. I was around enough and could observe, but sometimes there would be a lacking of intentionality. And I think in the church overall, and even in Village Park, we know that we're called to make disciples, but are we really being intentional? So when I think of the word intentional, I think of the word purposeful. I think of planned or almost premeditated. You know that this is something that you're really thinking about. We're calculating this. We're really making a plan that this is what we're going to do, and we're intentional about other things in our lives. My anniversary was recently, and so I planned to send my wife flowers, and so I made the plan, made the call, or ordered online, got them delivered, knew where they were going to be, all of those things, and so that was an intentional act. And so what we want to do, and what we've seen even in Village Park, is that many of you are trying to follow Jesus and are following Jesus, but we feel like in some ways we've got to do such a better job about being intentional about it. So this is our plan. We're going to be spelling this out for you, what we're planning to do. But when we look at the life and ministry of Jesus, we see obviously that he was an intentional leader. And he spent his entire life on God's mission that we looked at last week in Luke 19:10. He came to seek and save the lost. And in John 20, he says, in the same way I'm sending you out. That's how Jesus spent his ministry. He spent his days on earth raising up a generation after him. And I want to say this about generations. We'll get into it a little more, but it's not about the age of the person, the physical age. It's about taking people wherever they are on their spiritual journey, age-wise, and raising up another generation of followers. Look, the truth is that, I need to be raising up people and discipling people that will take my place, and you the same. And every person that not necessarily just take our place, but to follow Jesus as well and multiply the gospel out. And so we want you to turn to John chapter 6. We're going to look at a story here where Jesus was really intentional about discipleship. And so I want you to look at this with us this morning. So we'll be in John chapter 6. We'll begin in verse 5. But Jesus there's a great crowd that's following Jesus. And in verse 5, Jesus says something. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, and Philip is one of the disciples, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? And he said this to test him, for he himself, Jesus, knew what he would do. And Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. And what's interesting here, what we see about Jesus and his intentional leadership in this moment is that he's presenting a challenge to his disciples, and he's wanting to see how they will respond. So obviously when you read some of the stories before this, there was instruction that had gone on. They had seen some other miracles. But in this case, he's doing something, he's testing Philip. He's putting a challenge before them to see how they would respond. And then notice in verse 8, and one of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many? And Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, listen to this, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. And so they gathered them up in the 12 baskets with fragments. They gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. And so just a couple of observations here. He first is going to challenge them. How are we going to feed these people?
Yeah.
And we notice that in his answer, in Philip's answer, there was room for growth. Because he's thinking, well, we can't feed them. Yeah. Almost like forgetting, well, Jesus is there, right? But then later in the miracle, Jesus gives them an opportunity to serve. When you read this story in some of the other Gospels, you see that Jesus gave the food to the disciples, the baskets, and then they began to distribute it. So he gave them an opportunity to serve and do the work of ministry, but also while watching them. So we see he's intentional. He's challenging them. He's given them a job with instructions, and then, he lets them do it and be a part of it. And I think that's a part of his strategy when we talk about intentional leadership.
And we've talked before, especially about this one. I feel like Jesus does a lot of different levels of intentionality throughout his training with the disciples. But very early on, it's definitely more of an observing. I mean, like even with Jesus turning water into wine, the servants of the party are the ones who do it, not the disciples. Like there's these opportunities where you're kind of looking at it and you're like, okay, why is he not putting the disciples into more action? But he knows he has a plan in place, and so there's this time of observation that he gives, and then this is a big moment and it comes with questions, it comes with challenges, and it comes with these things where he's intentionally putting them into action, here. And so, it's a big moment. It's a big moment for the disciples. And
in all of them, regardless of whether they're just observing or they're serving or being a part, Jesus' goal in all of it is always to grow them, always to take another step of faith. So Philip, who at the beginning said, what are this small boy's lunch among so many? At the end of it, they've got baskets filled with fragments. And that moment of both the teaching, both the observation, the participation they had solidified their faith. And each step and each miracle and each ministry opportunity that Jesus gave them was just another step, right? So right on the heels of this one in John 6, if you look in Matthew 14, there's another example. Jesus sends them on the boat. He disperses the huge crowd, and there's a storm on the sea. The wind has come up against the boat. And then Jesus walks to them on the water, and we all know the story. And this instance of intentional discipleship is really compelling to me because they see Jesus, they're afraid, and then he, of course, identifies, "It's me, don't be afraid." Yeah. And then Peter says, "Lord, bid me to, or ask me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." So here's this moment. I mean, the sea is there's a storm, and Peter, he's got this faith that probably was in some ways like bolstered by the fact that they imagine the talk on the boat, like, dude, can you believe that? I mean, we had that little lunch and fed all these people. So their faith is like really, oh, if that's Jesus, I'll walk on the water. But then the story, Peter gets out there on the water and he takes his eyes off Jesus, and Peter begins to sink. And then he cries out to the Lord, "Save me." And the Lord does, of course, rescues him. But then he says, "Why did you doubt, O ye of little faith?" And so in that, there's like in the feeding of the 5,000, there's a challenge to see how they would respond. But in this one, what's so compelling to me is that Peter asks the Lord to do something, and Peter does it, and the Lord lets him fail. Yeah. And even that's a part of it, to show him, again, though, it's about faith. He lets them fail in some way, but in the end of it, it's to teach them a lesson about faith, to grow their faith. And I think sometimes, like with my kids, I don't want them to fail, and I want to do everything I can to, keep them from failing. I think we have to be responsible, and you guys understand what I'm talking about. But there is a certain part of that growth that happens from our failures, even.
Yeah, and I think this is, one of the biggest parts of intentional leadership is this right here, because there are times as a leader where, I can be so focused on the outcome or the speed with which I'm doing it that I miss opportunities to bring people along, and Jesus wasn't, here interested in the result. It was a moment for teaching, right? Yeah. Giving him that chance to fail. For Peter to have seen all this and still lose focus, lose faith for that moment, that obviously that's something that sticks with him throughout the rest of his time, and so no, I mean in all aspects we see the intentionality of Jesus, even with someone like Judas. And I think of when he's displaying being a intentional servant leader and showing them these truths by washing their feet, and even the feet of Judas, he washes his feet, knowing what Judas is about to do. So, no, I mean, I think it's a great point.
I think that's a good point too, because sometimes when it comes to discipleship, we might pour into someone, but ultimately they don't follow Jesus. But we still have to be intentional about what we do. And I learned a lot in my ministry about failure, but go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, we're like, and even in today's standards, it's like, where do you go to church? And we may disciple people that don't go to Village Park, and that's okay. That's not our job is to disciple.
Yeah, our job is to build the kingdom within the context of our church, but the kingdom is what we really look for. And I've said this so many times, like when you look at the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are the stories of the life of Jesus and his teachings, the word church appears twice, Matthew 16 and Matthew 18. But kingdom is everywhere.
Yeah.
Jesus constantly taught about the kingdom. And so, yeah, the commission, the call to make disciples is the commission of the church to build the kingdom that Jesus came to usher in, right? And that's going to take intentional leadership on all of us. And so I want you to think about this for just a moment. Who are the people who intentionally discipled you? You know, who are the people that poured into your life when we asked the question? But maybe some of these resonate with you. We have some options here. I want you to just think about it and maybe share with us in the comments about you. And when you think about your own discipleship, here's some options. Maybe you're this person. I had no one to lead me, so I picked it up on my own. And I've shared I had people to lead me and did a great job, but there were certain elements that I, kind of picked up on my own. Maybe this resonates. Those I followed were not as intentional as I see Jesus was, right? We've talked about the intentionality of Jesus. So maybe there were some people that poured into your life, but maybe it just wasn't with the intentionality that we see in the life of Jesus. Or maybe I had leaders who were very intentional with me, and what a blessing that is. But what we want you to know, wherever you are in your discipleship journey, whether you didn't have someone that was intentional, or maybe there's a mixture of intentionality and then also kind of catching things, or you were a part of someone discipling you and really pouring into your life, we want you to know really two things. The first one is that regardless of where you are, you can learn to be a disciple maker, and that's what we're aiming to do. We're going to be taking people through and discipling them. So regardless of where you are, you can be discipled, even if no one's ever discipled you before. But the second thing is that we, as a leadership team, Jonathan, the elders, have made a commitment that we are going to be committed to intentional discipleship in our church. And I was having lunch this week with someone, and one of the things about Village Park that I really love, and I love where we're going with this, is that we're really more about people than we are programs. Like, I'm not here to build programs. I can do that. I've got skills that I've obtained, through ministry and training and all that. But it's not about a program, it's about people. It's about investing in people, and that's what Jesus did. Like, when you look at the life of Jesus, he poured into people. He never had a church building, never had one kid's ministry, never had a nursery, right? And I'm not saying those things are in and of themselves bad. They may be necessary, but it's really ultimately about pouring into people.
Well, and think about this. You just have this moment here that we read of Jesus feeding the 5,000. 5,000 people.
Yeah.
How easy could it have been? I mean, hey, we're going to get here every week, and every week we're going to show up at the same time, same place, and Jesus is going to, we might have to have a budget for food. Mm-hmm. Jesus will just multiply it, and we'll eat, and we'll have good teaching, and there you go. You've got your program. But that's not what he does.
Yeah.
He doesn't build a following of 5,000. That he focuses on the 12. He focuses on the relationships.
That's good. And you see that, like, talking about relationships, that we talk about intentional leadership as one part, and then relationships, what we might call relational environment. So I want you to turn to the book of Acts. And when you were talking just what Jonathan just shared, man, when you look at the early church and the way that they ministered, it really was just a mirror image of the way Jesus was, right? So in the book of Acts, when you look at it, this is the church to me in the purest form. And when I read the book of Acts, I always think of this ever since I saw it on Antiques Roadshow years ago. There was a guy that had a blanket sitting on his rocking chair. He brought it into the appraisers, and the guy who's appraising this blanket, in the course of their conversation, says you probably noticed when you came in, it took my breath away. Well, what the guy had was what's called a Ute Chief blanket. It's a Navajo blanket. And he said, not only is this, old, it is the first type of Navajo weaving. And so he talks about later, there were more of the diamond type of designs in the Navajo weaving. But he says and he makes a statement, he says, Navajo weaving in its purest form. And he tells the guy, you have a national treasure to see one in that kind of shape. Well, this blanket that's been sitting on his chair, they appraised it at $500,000. I think they sold it at auction at like $450,000 for a blanket that was sitting on his rocking chair.
We'll check the blankets.
Yeah, exactly. But the point of that is that when I read the book of Acts, much of what we see in the church today, I think, and I fear, is that it's become almost a different form. But when we read the book of Acts, it's the church in its purest form. It's in its infancy. It hasn't had so much of the things that so many of the things that we see that kind of get the church convoluted and off mission. So in Acts chapter 2, I want you to see relationships. That's what we're going to talk about just for a few moments. But as we read through this passage, what we want you to do as you're listening and as you're reading, we want you to listen for words that speak about relationships, okay? And as you hear them, just write them out in the comments, and then we'll kind of come back and talk about them. So Jonathan, why don't you just read the 42, starting at 42? Acts 2:42.
And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers.
Keep going. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. And all came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts.
All right, so what words did you guys hear in there about fellowship? Just share our relationships, I should say. And so just a couple that I hear and heard in that have to do with relationships. One is in verse 42, and it's the word fellowship, right? Fellowship is the Greek word, means a sharing. And certainly what we see in the early church, that it was all about each other. It was all about the relationships and the togetherness of the church. So that's one for me.
Yeah, we see the word together, right? They had all things in common there in 44. I can't even imagine how that would look today.
Yeah.
in our context.
I had a professor in college that talked about this, and it was important to make the distinction. He said there are some things in Scripture that are descriptive, and some of them are prescriptive. So some things are God's revealed this in His Word, and He's telling you that's what you should do. But there's other times where He's just simply describing what happened. And I think this is one of those cases. Like, it's not necessarily saying that every church, everybody's got to sell everything they got, and But what He's saying is this is what the fellowship and the togetherness and the relationship in this church look like, right?
So, and can you imagine being so close with people that when a need comes up, that you just sell stuff?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing, and the relationship that was there. I love the phrase in verse 46 and verse 47. It's repeated, and day by day. Mm-hmm. This was not like, to me, relationship building can't be once a week.
Yeah.
Right? We gather on Sundays and we're together, and then that's our relationship. I mean, the relationships, if we're going to truly disciple people and be the church that God's called us to be, it's got to be every day. That's what Jesus did. I mean, it wasn't like a Sunday Jesus and then a Tuesday Jesus. I mean, Jesus was, on mission every day. And then, of course, in verse 46, what I really love, and that's they're in the temple together, but then they're breaking bread from house to house.
Yeah.
So it was not just the big church, so to speak, right? So at Village Park, what we do, we gather on Sundays, here on Sunday mornings live, and then we gather now, we're able to gather in person. And that's kind of, to me, what the Acts 2:46 of gathering in the temple is, right? There are times when the church needs to come together, and we worship together, we receive the word, and the word is preached, we build each other up, we edify, we pray for each other, and there is certainly and should be a regular time of meeting, and all of us need to be in the habit of regularly assembling with the body together. That to me is no question. And there is a certain measure of relationship there, but at Village Park, our main thrust of relationship building is through small groups. And that's where you get together with 12 people, 10 people. Yeah. And then even from there are close relationships that are formed, so that then we move toward intentional discipleship, right?
And even that, if we're not careful, can become about the weekly, we met. But we're called to live life together. Those people in that small group become your family, and you go to each other's kids' games or celebrate different walks of life, birthdays, whatever it may be together.
I've shared before, one of my favorite things about the relationships in small group is when somebody goes in the hospital in our church, if something happens, and before I can get to the hospital, somebody calls and says, hey, they're in the hospital, will you go visit? Their small group has already visited, and their small group has already put them on a meal train, and they're already praying for them. That to me is what really it's about. And that's the environment that we want to create, where it's like Jesus, he would speak to the crowds, but there were 12 that he really invested in, but not so that those 12 could be just a perpetual same group, like a Sunday school class or the same small group. And regardless of what we're doing, it's always going to be us. No, Jesus knew at the end of all this, they're going to be scattered to the ends of the earth with the gospel. And so that's what we want our small groups to be, to multiply, the gospel. And that's why we talk about a reproducible process, right? It's all about multiplication. That what we want to do is we want to have intentional leadership. We want to have relational environments like small groups where we come together and we grow in our faith. We encourage each other. We love each other. We live life together. But at the end of all this, we want to take them somewhere.
And so that's where we've talked about these two things that I think as Village Park we've tried to do well. I think we've done the relational environment well, and we've tried to be intentional. Mm-hmm. We're doing better at that. We're working on that. But really, the question that we kind of came to was, what does that reproducible process look like? And so that was kind of what kickstarted the journey of searching for what does discipleship need to look like, and that kind of stuff.
And we heard the analogy of, like, if you're going to take a road trip, you have you know where you want to go, and so you have a car, you have a driver, and then you have your map, right? So you get in your car, and the car is the way, the mode that you're going to get there, right? And that for us is the relational environments. Like, how we're going to lead people to discipleship is the car, right? It's the relational environment. And then you have the driver, that's intentional leadership. Somebody's got to take us there, right? But what if you don't have a map? So you get in your car and you want to go to the Grand Canyon, but you don't know how to get there. And I think that's where maybe there's been for us a little bit of a breakdown, but in talking to people who've in their church built in what discipleship really looks like, that's where the light began to come on with me, is that there is a process that we can follow. And it makes me think of, just this week was talking to Alan and Leslie Reese. You guys know that they just had a beautiful baby, and so went over to visit them. We were just chatting about that, and they were talking about that with the second kid, they feel so much more comfortable, right? There's because they've been through it before, and that's what happens as a parent. With each kid, it kind of gets where you're like, okay, I'm okay with this, but that baby is going to grow, and there's going to be certain stages of that, right? They're going to be laying there, they're born, then they hold their head up, and everybody oohs and ahs like, oh, look at him hold his head up, right? And then it's rolling over, it's sitting up, it's, feeding yourself, holding your own bottle, crawling, right? Then there's walking and running, jumping, and they're just growth. Yeah. And then the next kid that comes along, they're going to follow that same process, so to speak, of growth. And then they get to the point where they're teens, and they develop this amazing ability to just constantly ask you for money, because that's what I'm discovering now with a teenager in the house. But that's what you see, growth, right? That's what we're wanting to do.
And I love you sharing that. And you earlier you had mentioned that it doesn't matter what age you are physically, right? Mm-hmm. It's about where your spiritual maturity is. And so I think it's a great analogy. We all go through that process, and there's something new with Maya, and we talk about kids and stuff, and one of the things you always said was, like, you don't see a 17-year-old sucking a pacifier, right? Like, they're going to grow out of it. And so I think that even speaks to the fact that if we're not intentional, eventually they'll get there, but are they going to get there in the right ways? Like with Maya, we have to be intentional about teaching her how to eat food. That's like our biggest issue right now with her. And she needs to move from the bottle to solids, because it's for her growth, and it's for her good. And so, we see that analogy with our spiritual lives as well. It's all throughout the Bible, right? We talk about how as spiritual babes, as infants, when we're saved and we start learning, we long for that milk, we hunger for it, the Word of God, but we've got to grow up, we've got to move forward. And so
you're talking about moving from the milk to the meat.
Meat, and so we've got to move to the things that would continue to help us grow spiritually. And here's the deal: eventually, when we combine all this together, we're not called to reach this level of knowledge or this level of faith, even in our relationship with Jesus, and forget about our relationship with others. right? We're not called to just do two of the three things. We're not called to follow Jesus, let him transform us, and then not be on mission, right? And so we would say that you're not through the process until you are making disciples, right?
Yeah, we're not trying to raise up Bible Jeopardy champs, right, that have all the information. We want people that are really going to be doing it. And so there's a process, right, where you take someone who doesn't know Christ, and if you can, in your mind, imagine a person who doesn't know Christ, we want to share the gospel and then take them on a journey of growth, just like you would help guide your kid as they grow. And that's not, I'm not saying that in a condescending way, just saying that's the reality. And I found in my own life that hopefully, you know, I'm an adult, right? A parent that is able to reproduce disciples.
Yeah.
But there are times at certain points in my journey, I may take a step back, right, in my growth. And part of discipleship is having people that will continue to encourage you and challenge you and teach you and model for you growth and moving forward.
And one other thing with it, you talk about, you know, as parents, that second kid is easier because you've already gone through the process. It's also easier because you have another kid that can kind of also help lead that way. And as
model
leader,
it,
and model it. And as leaders, sometimes we come to this and we think like Village Park, we're not a mega church, but we've got, we've come into contact with a good number of people.
Yeah.
And how do we walk the church through all this? Well, it starts with the leadership, right? But once we go through that first generation, those first kids, then they come alongside us and they help build that and it grows. So,
and I think that the point of all of that is that if we're going to do this as a church, it's going to take every single person being committed to this and understanding that all of us are called and commissioned by Jesus to go and make disciples. It's not just the pastor or leader's job to make disciples. It's all of us. We're all called to make disciples. And so as we kind of wrap this up, here are a few questions we want you to just consider and think about. Where are you in your growth, as a believer? Are you a driver? Are you a person that can be an intentional leader that can get people in the car of relationships, right, and take them to a place where then they can make disciples? And so maybe that's you, or maybe you want to be. Maybe you'd say, look, I feel like I've grown, I'm growing. I want somebody to come alongside and show me how to be an intentional leader and disciple. If that's you, comment below, or you can text us, 832-316-4912, whatever. But just to say, hey, we want to be a part of this. We want to be a part of discipleship. Or maybe, another question, are you in a relational environment? That's really important. The Christian life and the call to make disciples cannot be lived on an island. We're created for relationships. The church is here to foster relationships of growth, and that's what the church is for. So maybe you've been sitting out on small groups, and some of that might be just because of availability, and we get that we're starting small and starting to multiply. But if you're going to really grow in your faith and as a disciple, I believe that you have to have a relationship or an environment where relationships can be formed. So I want to encourage you, to be a part of a small group, even if you can't come to one in person, be a part of one of the Zoom ones until we multiply these these small groups into other ones. Yeah. But really to be a part of that. But then also just ask you, like, will you commit to the discipleship process? Maybe what you need to be thinking about is where you are in your journey is to say, who is someone that God has placed in my life that I need to disciple me? Yeah. And maybe you just need to have that conversation and say, look, I need you to pour into me. Will you do that, right? Wherever you are in this, it's going to take all of us being committed to it together. And I know that we have been firmly committed over the last year, especially to say this is who we believe we need to be. This is what we need to be doing. And so that's what we're going to be leading you through. Now, the next few weeks, we're going to be showing you what this reproducible process looks like. So we'll talk in more detail about that, the different stages and areas of growth. So we want you to come back and be a part of that. But today, I just want to close our time in prayer, and then we got a few announcements about a few things with the church. But just really be thinking about where you are in the process, and if you'd like to be involved in that in some way, we want to encourage you to reach out. Comment, send us a message. You can text us at the number I mentioned earlier. Whatever it is, get a hold of us, and we'll get you started on that journey, and I think it's an important journey for all of us. So I'll close our time in prayer. Father, thank you just for the opportunity to share the word today and to be together and have this conversation. I thank you for all those that have watched this, God, and I pray that wherever they are in the process or in the journey, that you would surround them with the people that will lead them intentionally and encourage them in their growth. I pray that you'll use me, you'll use Jonathan, you'll use the leadership at the church, you'll use all of us to fulfill the commission and your call in our lives to go and make disciples who follow Jesus, that are being transformed by Jesus, and are on mission with Jesus. And so we just pray that you would use what you've laid on our hearts, God, from your word to really make an impact in our church and ultimately in our community and around the world. Use us, God, for the sake of your kingdom, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So thanks for joining us today. Really quickly before we go, tonight we have our in-person gathering. No balloons, don't worry, nothing like that. But tonight we do have something really special. It's our camp service. So obviously COVID this year just wiped out all opportunities for camp. So our teens have actually been at a Survivor weekend this weekend, and it's been an amazing time. But tonight they're going to come back to Memorial, and then we'll all gather for worship. We have a worship team coming. The Undone is the name of this worship team worship band that Jonathan and Robert and others were a part of. But they're going to lead us in worship tonight. We have a few surprises, but we also want to let you know that one of my favorite parts about camp, obviously the spiritual part is the best part of it, but just the part where we get to build relationships with people is in the evening at the snack bar. Yeah. And these kids, especially the preteen kids, I mean, they spend all their money the first day always have ice cream and all these different things. So tonight, after the service, I've asked my good friends Brandon and Juliet. They are bringing their Tiki's truck, and they have a shaved ice truck. They're going to have snow cones. They also have ice cream sandwiches, different things that you can get. So tonight we're going to, after the service, kind of have time at the snack bar with Tiki. So I'm really excited. If you've never had their stuff, their snow cones are so stinking good. But it helps us be able to support another local business, but give us some time, fellowship together. And the church is sponsoring all of the treats tonight. This is our treat of, get together. So only one, though. You can't go up for two. No, see, already beat you to it.
Come on.
So we want you to come and be a part of that, but also invite someone to come and be a part. And then next Sunday evening, I want to talk about next Sunday evening really quickly. We've been taking it back. We've celebrated birthdays, celebrated Mother's Day, Father's Day. Tonight we're celebrating camp. And then next Sunday evening, we're going to have our Easter service. And so we're actually going to have an Easter egg hunt for the kids. We're working through some logistics. We will announce the time. We're figuring out if after the service would work, but there's some things with logistics and lighting that we're trying to figure out. But next Sunday evening, we will have Easter. Going to be fantastic, a time to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus and let the kids have an Easter egg hunt on the ground. So that should be a lot of fun. So those are all ordered. But then next Sunday morning, we want to encourage you to be back here. Join us again live. We'll continue our conversation about discipleship. And so we're going to teach a little bit next week on what it means to share our faith with those who are without Christ. So hope you'll join us back here next Sunday at 10 o'clock. Until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you. We love you guys, and we'll see you all either in person or online tonight.